All right, let's get started. My name is Cassie Dorf, and this is another workshop for the online Peace Science Colloquium meeting. The OPSC is affiliated with the Peace Science Society, and we got going with this workshop series in 2015. We were really interested in promoting excellent research outside of just the conference meeting, as well as helping one another and our fellow peers and scholars hash out their projects, and also making that publicly available for others to watch and to engage with. I am Cassie Dorf. I'm an assistant professor at Vanderbilt University, and I'm the co-director of this series with Brad Smith, who is also an assistant professor at Vanderbilt with me. So we're hanging out in Tennessee together. And today we have a really awesome paper that I'm going to introduce, and we also have a great crew and cast of discussants. So today our paper is titled The Ethnicization of Syria's Conflict, a Social Media Analysis by Alex Siegel, who's currently a postdoc at the Immigration Policy Lab at Stanford University, and Yael Zeira, who's an assistant professor of political science and international studies at the University of Mississippi. They've co-authored this paper along with Dean Freelon, an associate professor in the School of Media and Journalism at UNC Chapel Hill. And now for our cool crew of discussants, we have Laura Paylor, who is an assistant professor in the Department of Political Science at the University of Pittsburgh. Anita Godes, professor of international and cybersecurity at the Hertie School of Governance in Berlin. And Johanna Benier, professor of the Department of Government and Politics at the University of Maryland. And I actually forgot to check your affiliation, so I hope that's right. Cool. The authors will present for about 15 minutes, and then we'll open it up for discussion. So if y'all want to go ahead and get started, please do.
Thank you so much, Cassie and Brad, who's not here, and to our discussants. This is such a public service, and we're really happy to get your feedback on this paper, particularly as it is in relatively early stages. So what we are going to present today is really just a preliminary analysis as well as a research design for a wider project. And so let me just share my screen, and I'll go ahead and start. Can you all hear me well?
Looks and sounds great.
Okay. Okay, so thank you again. We are presenting on the ethnicization of Syria's conflict, as Cassie mentioned. So ethnic conflicts are often seen as especially violent and intractable. For example, ethnic conflicts are often thought to last longer and be more difficult to resolve. But how and why do some conflicts become ethnic in the first place? In much of the literature on political conflict and violence, the ethnic quality of ethnic violence is a given. Ethnic cleavages or divisions predate conflict and are exogenous to conflict itself. So ethnicity drives conflict and not the other way around. In contrast, constructivist perspectives on ethnicity that we are very much inspired by argue that, as Brubaker and Leighton put it, the ethnic quality of ethnic violence is not intrinsic to the act itself. It emerges through after-the-fact interpretive claims. And these claims are actually contested, producing what Donald Horowitz has called a meta-conflict about the meaning of the conflict itself. So in sum, conflicts become ethnic through a process of ethnicization. And it is this process that we're interested in exploring in this project. So this gives rise to two main questions that we're addressing. The first is, when and why do conflict actors advance ethnic frames, narratives, and interpretations of conflict? And the second is, when and why do they succeed? That is, under which conditions will ethnic frames and narratives of conflict win the war of ideas, or the meta-conflict of what the conflict is really about? We answer these questions using original social media data from the ongoing civil conflict in Syria. And I should say that Syria is the launching point and the motivation for this project, but we're also planning a wider cross-national comparative study on the sources and dynamics of ethnicization. In this paper today, however, we'll focus on Syria. And we chose this case to start with for two reasons. First of all, as you no doubt are aware, the Syria conflict began as an anti-regime revolution, similar to that and other anti-regime revolutions going on around it as part of the Arab uprisings, and evolved over time into a multidimensional conflict with an increasingly ethno-sectarian hue. And secondly, the Syrian conflict has been called the most socially mediated conflict in history. So much of this process of ethnicization, like other conflict processes, played out not only in the real world, but also online, providing us with valuable data that we can then use to uncover this process. So our general approach in the project is to measure and explain the relative salience of ethnic, non-ethnic, and what we call counter-ethnic rhetoric over both time, over the duration of the conflict, as well as over space, so in different locations and areas within Syria. And before moving on, I just want to kind of briefly say what we mean by these terms. So we are thinking about ethnic rhetoric as rhetoric about a country, conflict, and or conflict actors that explicitly or implicitly invokes an ethnic category to promote an in-group, exclude an out-group, or highlight intergroup divisions. Similarly, non-ethnic rhetoric is then rhetoric about a country, conflict, or conflict actors that explicitly or implicitly invokes a non-ethnic category, for instance, students, to promote an in-group, exclude an out-group, and so on. Finally, we're also interested in this third category of counter-ethnic rhetoric, which is rhetoric that explicitly or implicitly rejects the use of ethnic categories for these purposes. So in order to be able to identify these kinds of rhetoric, we need to also specify which ethnic identities we are going to include in the first place. And this is a much more complicated question than it may first appear. So we start here with Chandra's definition of ethnic categories as a subset of identity categories in which eligibility for membership is based on attributes that are either associated with or believed to be associated with descent. And this is really kind of an umbrella definition that includes a wide array of what we might normally consider ethnic categories, including the main categories we're paying attention to in Syria of religion and sect. Scholars of ethnic politics also commonly distinguish among different kinds of ethnic categories, and specifically between what Chandra and Wilkinson have called ethnic structure and ethnic practice, and others have used different names to refer to very, very similar concepts. And in this project, our starting point is ethnic structure, which we can think of as the nominal identities that all individuals in a population possess, whether they identify with them or not. And we want to start with ethnic structure because we're interested in understanding which identities are subsequently activated during the course of conflict and why. So in order to do that, we need to start with, or we need to get as close as possible to capturing all identities, activated and non-activated, and then be able to see how the strength and salience of these identities differs throughout the course of the conflict. So what we're going to be doing in this project is, for instance, in the case of Syria, mapping Syria's pre-conflict ethnic structure and then tracing the relative salience of different identities and the prevalence of rhetoric about these identities throughout the course of the conflict. So this again is tricky because up until now, there really haven't been any reliable data on ethnic structure, that is nominal identities, as distinct from ethnic practice, activated identities. So actually, one of the closest efforts to date has been the project by Johanna and her collaborators, AMAR, All Minorities at Risk, which focuses on socially relevant identities. But even this data set focuses on identities that are activated in the social sphere, although not necessarily in the political sphere. And what we want to do is take it even a step further back and get to all, as our starting point, start with all identities, even those that may not be activated in public life in any way whatsoever. And so how do we do that? Again, capturing ethnic structure is notoriously and well-documentedly difficult. And it's unlikely that there's going to be any one complete and comprehensive data set of ethnic structure, even for a single country like Syria. And so following Bernier et al., we first begin by triangulating all existing data sets on ethnic groups in Syria. So we found 8 data sets to start with, and we first begin by taking all identities listed in those data sets, which totals up to 23 identities. And then what we do is we try to address some of the problems that have troubled past data sets, which have to do with measuring ethnicity, which are the problems with the multidimensionality of ethnicity. So, ethnicity can be religion, nationality, tribe, language. So there are multiple dimensions. And then there's also a theoretical empirical question about the level of aggregation at which we should measure on these dimensions. So for example, do we measure at the level of the religion or the sect? And so what we do is we try to address these problems by systematically mapping this initial list of identities that we got from the existing 8 data sets and mapping them along multiple dimensions and levels of aggregation. So I'll just run through a brief example using the category Alawi, which is a religious identity at the sub-sect level, and is the identity, of course, that is associated with the ruling regime in Syria. And so again, this is a religious identity. It's on the dimension of religion, and it's at the sub-sect level. So Alawis are a heterodox sect of Shia Islam, which is itself, of course, a sect of Islam. And so if we aggregate up from Alawi, then we get to both Shia Islam or Shia Muslims as well as Muslim, and these categories should then also be included in our data set. We don't disaggregate largely because we've imposed a population threshold of 1% for inclusion in our data set. So disaggregating further is likely to get us below that threshold to very, very, very small groups. And then we also find equivalent categories, which are categories that are both on the same dimension and on the same level of aggregation, but may not be included in the initial list captured from the 8 data sets. So for example, if the identity category Alawi is included, and it typically is in all of the data sets on Syria, we should also include other religious identities at the subsect level, which would also include other subsects of Islam or sects of Shia Islam in particular, such as Ismaili and Twelver, as well as subsects of other religious groups, such as Greek Orthodox and Syrian Orthodox, which are, again, subsects of Christianity and sects of Eastern Orthodoxism. So at the risk of getting in the weeds, I just wanted to kind of give you a flavor for what this process involves. And you can see that this significantly expands the range of groups that we are starting with. There's our original list of 23 is over here on my left. I think you're right, if you're looking at the screen. And then this produces an expanded list of 56 identities. And I'll just say one more thing before turning it over to Alex. So once we have this list, which we've already produced for Syria, our plan then is, we are going to be conducting a Facebook survey online targeted at Syrians, both living inside and outside Syria, in order to try to understand the way that people actually talk about these identities. So when people talk about these identities online, they may not say, Alawis or Chechens or what have you, right? They may use other kinds of labels, including sometimes potentially derogatory labels to talk about these groups. And so we're using a Facebook survey to actually crowdsource those labels and identify the way that Syrians actually talk about Syria. And then those will become the inputs for our machine learning models that we're then going to use to measure the salience of these identities and the prevalence of ethnic rhetoric in and about the conflict. So with that, I'll turn it over to Alex, who is going to talk more about our data and preliminary analysis. Thank you.
Okay, great. Thank you, Yael. Here, let me just share my screen. Let's see. Make it full screen. Can you all see this okay?
Looks great.
Okay, great. So to get into the data and give you kind of a flavor of what we are actually planning to do here, so we begin with a collection of every public tweet that contained the Arabic word Syria, collected between March 2011 at the very start of the conflict and July 2013. And this data came from Dean Freelon, who was actually actively collecting tweets right at the start of the Arab Spring revolutions. And the reason why this is important is if we were to go back and use historical data, quite a bit would be deleted. So this was actually gathered in real time, so we're not likely to be missing anything here. And as you can see, as the conflict goes on, we get kind of a higher daily volume of tweets, but it's quite bursty in response to given events. So what are we going to do with this? So basically what we want to do is develop measures of ethnicization. And what we want to do is we want to come up with a way of measuring how over time the salience of ethnic, non-ethnic, and counter-ethnic rhetoric shifts across this period. And we're going to use two different approaches. The first is a machine learning augmented dictionary-based approach. So the idea is that we start with these crowdsourced terms that Yael mentioned, of terms that are used to describe this long list of identities. And we're first going to augment them with word-to-vec dictionaries. And basically what this means is it allows us to find similar terms that are co-occurring with these words in our data set to build out a larger initial dictionary. But the problem with just using a dictionary is there may be tweets that contain some of these terms that aren't actually referencing an ethnic or non-ethnic identity. So to try to address this, we're again going to rely on crowdsourcing, and we're going to use a platform called Figure 8, which allows us to get lots of native Arabic speakers to code these tweets according to whether or not they actually say express something about an ethnic, non-ethnic, or counter-ethnic identity. And this is going to help allow us to remove false positives from the data. So if there are tweets that were categorized as ethnic but aren't actually ethnic, for example, we should catch this here. And the goal is, once we've tagged all these tweets, is to have basically daily measures which we can think about as either a proportion or volume or number or proportion of unique users producing each type of rhetoric over time. But relying on these specific dictionary-based approaches can be problematic because conflict rhetoric is so rapidly evolving. So to try to get a second measure here, we're also going to rely on what's called a bag of communities approach. And the intuition here is that we find sort of naturally annotated or naturally occurring examples of the types of text we're interested in. And we basically say, okay, here is a Facebook group, for example, which is known to produce a lot of nasty sectarian rhetoric. Can we see over time how similar are the tweets in our data set to the rhetoric being produced in this well-known community with a specific orientation. And we could do this for lots of different ethnic groups and groups that are known to put out counter-ethnic rhetoric, etc., as just another means of developing a real-time measure of how this language shifts over time. So just to give you an initial sense of how this might work. This is sort of a pared down version of the approach where we just take well-known terms for the identities that Yael gave an example of in that table and track over time what proportion of the tweets about Syria contain words that indicate they might be referencing ethnic identities and words that indicate that they might be referencing non-ethnic identities. So this is a simplified version of the approach that we're ultimately going to use. But even in this sort of simplified, potentially noisier approach, what we kind of see is looking across this time period, in the early months of the conflict, we see this sharp increase in the proportion of ethnic rhetoric that increases up until about 2012 and then kind of levels off. And at the same time, we're seeing a decrease in the salience of non-ethnic rhetoric. And this is just for all the tweets that reference Syria in Arabic. But so where are these tweets coming from? They're obviously not just coming from Syria. Quite a lot of Arabic language discourse comes from the Gulf and Egypt. And as you can see here from this map, these tweets are actually coming from across the globe. So what happens if we limit this same analysis to just Syria itself? We also see this increase in ethnic rhetoric over time, but it's less steep and continues to increase across the first couple of years of the conflict. And we're not seeing the sort of comparable decrease in non-ethnic rhetoric until later. And so this is just to give you a flavor that there's going to be many ways we can kind of slice and dice this data to get a sense of where these narratives look different and where they seem to be coming from. So if we dig into this in a more granular way, do we see that, say, the more intense ethnic narratives initially emerge in the Gulf or somewhere outside of Syria and then later come in Syria itself? There's many sort of hypotheses around these processes that we may be able to test. And just as sort of a preliminary way of seeing what are we capturing here, what are the actual differences between these ethnic and non-ethnic categories, when we use a structural topic model to just look at what are the main topics showing up in these different kinds of language, what we see is on the non-ethnic side, there are topics like Assad corruption or international diplomacy, refugees, regional diplomacy, that seem a bit more like the types of topics you might see in news stories and that are referencing things that are not explicitly ethnic. Whereas on the other side, in the ethnic category, we see things like sectarian slurs, enemies, casualties, massacres, infidels, death. So it seems like more kind of violent rhetoric and rhetoric associated with specific ethnic groups is showing up on the ethnic side. So this is just an initial gut check that we are actually picking up on something here, and most likely these distinctions will become even sharper when we're using our kind of more nuanced approach moving forward. So what can we do with this? When we have these real-time measures of ethnicization, we can also look at what actors are propagating these different narratives. So we might want to know who is influential in spreading these different types of narratives. And we're thinking, we haven't done this yet, about measuring this in two different ways. And so when we think about influence in a network online, we can think about retweet frequency and retweet reach. So the idea behind retweet frequency is that people who are retweeted more often, their messages are shared more widely, are more influential in the network. But we also might care about how influential the people that propagate their messages then are. So the first figure, retweet frequency, shows Alice being retweeted by lots of different people, and so she is the most influential person in the network. But in the second network, all of the people who retweet her have different levels of influence. So Bob is retweeted a lot also. So we care about that dynamic as well. But so there's many ways we could think about measuring this, but the idea is we can think about who are the actors that are actually propagating this. Is it religious leaders, political leaders? Is it sectarian media outlets? Is it extremist groups, et cetera? And we can really track this in a granular way using this data because we have elites, everyday citizens, and media outlets all on the same platform. So just to wrap up here and kind of get back into why we're doing this, I'll end with this quote by Brubaker and Layton, which says, "Sustained attention needs to be paid to the forms and dynamics of ethnicization and to the many and subtle ways in which violence and conditions, processes, activities, and narratives linked to violence can take on ethnic hues." And we think that our approach is going to allow us to basically operationalize this and measure not only how the prevalence of this language changes over time, but also what actors are involved in its spread over time and space. So as Yael mentioned, this is super preliminary, and so we're really excited for your feedback and really look forward to your comments. And thanks again for being here today.
Thanks so much, Alex. Great presentation. And now we get to just open it up to our discussants. Does anyone want to, jump in first, really start us off on a good foot? I see Laura might be unmuting herself.
Oh, no, I was just getting ready. I mean, I have so much that I could say. I don't know if I need to go first, if anybody. So I think, okay, fine. So overall, I think this is an incredibly interesting project with a ton of potential. I think there's sort of two kinds of feedback that maybe we could give you, and I'm curious to know what you think would be most helpful. So one is the things that jumped out at me about like the specifics of the data collection that I think could improve it, or things that I think might be worth considering. But then there's this bigger picture question of, how can you use the data once you actually have it? Because there are so many different questions that you could possibly investigate. And some of what comes out in the background and the context section is, what are the different possible puzzles, right? So even moving beyond explaining sort of network structure and influence, like when do we see variation in influence? When do we see, the counter-sectarian tweets being more or less effective in the wake of a sectarian? So part of what I'd like to know from you guys is what you think is most useful. But I think just a few big picture questions to start off, like per Cassie's request before getting into the details. One thing to me is it wasn't entirely clear what I should think of as the ethnification of the conflict a priori going in. So for instance, should we think of this as sectarian language replacing non-sectarian or cross-sectarian language? Or if we see a rise in all of them, right? So if we see sectarian discourse going up, but we also see non-sectarian and cross-sectarian discourse going up, like would that actually count as ethnification of the conflict, and how we should think about that. Second of all, this is a fundamentally group-based approach in that not only is the sectarian approach defined by in-group, out-group from a sectarian perspective, but also cross-sectarian and non-sectarian is also sort of fundamentally group-based, right? In the sense that you're still looking at whether people are referring to their in-groups, their out-groups. Might we think, however, that there's an alternate world in which there is no group-based references being made, and whether or not that would, possibly counteract the effects of sectarian identity. So there seems to be sort of a non-group-based way to think about it. And I wanted to hear, so like if you're looking at the overall proportion of tweets that are happening, and you see like a rise in tweets that are not referencing groups at all, like would that actually possibly be a de-ethnification? Like how should we think about that in terms of the overall ethnification of the project? In addition to that, I didn't see a lot of talk about the superordinate national identity, and I didn't see it listed in your identity list, even though you're using the Syria hash, you're using Syria as a filter for the tweets. How should we be thinking about national identity in this context? How are you going to be capturing national identity in the tweets? And so those are a few big ones. Maybe I will leave it there for now to let others jump in, and I have plenty more, but overall, very, very interesting.
Yeah, does anyone want to jump in to add to those kinds of set of comments? If not, we can take a short response from our authors. Anita?
Yeah, maybe one. So first of all, I also really enjoyed this. I think this is an amazing example of using social media data to answer a question, like a substantive question that we were interested in before social media existed, but then social media is giving us like a new way to study it. And I think those are like the most interesting questions we can ask. So I think this is really, really exciting. And like Laura had lots of ideas of what you could do with this. I'm sure that you have tons of plans for future papers as well. But I'll maybe just add to like the big conceptual question for me was, and this may be because I'm not an expert on ethnic conflict, was how does ethnicization come about, right? So it seems to be a macro level process that you're talking about within the conflict, right? Something that you're kind of tracking at the aggregate level, but you're using individual data to do that. And I mean, that's one of the big strengths of social media data, right? That we can look at it at the individual level. But the big question for me is like, what am I looking for? Am I looking for changes by individuals, that individuals are actually becoming more politicized along ethnic lines? Or am I looking for different people starting to talk about their ethnic views and identities and so on and so forth? And so I wasn't entirely sure what exactly the social media data is telling me. Are we talking about the same population over a longer period of time, or are we amplifying certain voices as the conflict progresses? And I think that has a lot of kind of methodological implications about what to do with the data afterwards. But that was kind of my big, more theoretical question.
And Johanna, did you want to jump in there?
Yes, so I have a sort of a broad question as well. I want to also start by saying how excited I am about this project. I think this is a great idea, and I think that if you know, at the end, if we can sort of organically extract the ethnic structure from a given context in real time or close to real time, then this promises that we can sort of continually update our sample frames so that they're always, you know, up to date and most appropriate for whatever question we're asking. And I think that that would be a huge step forward in the analysis, both of the endogenous identity creation, but also in this examination of how then identities influence their environment subsequently. And I also think, like has been said before, that you have a lot of different projects in here, and they're very, very interesting. I saw several different papers, just this difference between the external and the internal characterization of the tweets. I mean, that was fascinating to me. So I also have some sort of broader picture comments and then some more specific data comments. I'll start with some broader comments about the framing. One of the things with the framing that sort of struck me when I was reading this was that the discussion of ethnicity is all from the comparative literature and the IR literature on ethnicity. And there's also a very large literature that focuses specifically on religion. And in that literature, there is a discussion about whether religion has a unique relationship with conflict in some way, both in terms of the identity formation and outcomes. And I think that because the identity marker that you hone in on is religion, you need to address this literature more extensively. And for the empirical discussion, I would probably start with Isak Svensson and sort of Jonathan Fox to see what is in this literature. And then Brubaker has some recent conceptual stuff where he's thinking about the difference between what he calls ethnicity and what then is religion. And I can send you a recent literature review of this literature, if that would be helpful. I also think that Yael mentioned how difficult this concept of identity is. And I think that you may want to develop that a little bit better. I think it's developed more sort of empirically than conceptually in the paper currently. And I think that it was a little bit confusing. The discussion was a little bit confusing for me sometimes. So sometimes you talk about ethnicity and religion if they were two different things. Sometimes you talk about them as if they were one and the same. And you build sort of on Chandra's definition but her definition is constructed with an eye to a situation where religious identity is cross-cut by region and language, etc. And her main point, as I understand her writing, is with respect to defining identity is the complexity of identity structure and practice, where nested categories sort of collectively describe a person's ethnicity. So when she's talking about ethnicity, she's thinking about something specific, like a Gujarati Hindu from a particular caste as opposed to a Gujarati Muslim, etc. But when you're talking about ethnicity and recording ethnicity, you end up talking about all of Sunni in Syria, and this is a very large umbrella group that sort of that is cross-cut in so many ways that I'm not sure that Chandra would actually agree with you that it's a for that given context the best marker of an ethnic group, because the only thing that so many of the subgroups have in common is the religion. I don't think that you're wrong. I think that you just have to justify why you think that umbrella category is capturing what you're interested in capturing. And I understand that you start with sort of saying, well, there was a bigger umbrella group earlier that included many different religions, and then these other ones fell to the sideway. And then you're left with just the Sunnis, but the Sunnis are still an umbrella group containing many different tribes, many different peoples from different areas in Syria, etc. And I think that actually, so for example, you talk about the Assad thugs as not being an ethnic categorization, but I actually think that that's a category that would get much closer to what Chandra has in mind when she's talking about ethnic groups. I think that one of the things that sort of struck me is that the geography is in both your definition of ethnicity and non-ethnic categories. And so I think that you need to think about and think about your definition of ethnicity and conceptualization of ethnicity and why you end up honing in on that particular identity a little bit more clearly. And I think that would help. I think that some of the other people that have been doing work thinking about this empirically, Joel Selway has been looking a lot at cross-cutting in the context of conflict, and Avital Livni also has a paper where she's working on measuring identity, and I think that their work might help also if you look at that. That's my main sort of large conceptual comment, and then I have some observations about the data. So I'll stop there, and I'll add more when we start talking more about the data.
These are great comments. Authors, y'all want to respond a little bit, and then we can see where we go next.
Sure. So thank you all. This is super helpful, and I think you guys are tapping into a lot of the conceptual and kind of methodological challenges that we have been struggling with as we've tried to move forward with this. And I think this discussion is going to help us clarify sort of some of the best steps forward. So first, this really interesting question of like, what would we call ethnicization? Is it just that the salience of ethnic categories is increasing over time, or is it ethnic relative to non-ethnic or counter-ethnic, or should it be relative to, as Laura was saying, sort of the mention of no group at all? I think this is like a really interesting and important question, and one of the things that's nice about this data is we can try it lots of different ways, but we also want to think through, depending on exactly what we're testing, what makes the most sense kind of from a theoretical standpoint. I think when we looked at those initial graphs, our kind of initial thinking was, oh, maybe it's the point at which they cross or something is like somehow meaningful, but you could also imagine that just an upward trend in the salience of ethnic identities is in and of itself really important. So that's something we are sort of just at this starting point of wanting to think through more, and is super interesting. Yeah, I'll jump in.
Yeah, there's so much here to think about already. Thank you all so much. Let me maybe just tackle a few things. So I think one thing that several of you picked up on is the tension between the group level and the individual level. And we're also thinking about that. And I think that, you know, one of the challenges here is, I think in part because of the lack of data, kind of more granular data until now, that so many of our theories are actually at the group level. And so part of our theoretical challenge is that we haven't done quite as much yet, is thinking about how to take these group level theories and make them testable at the individual level. And we're really excited, you know, at what these data we think will allow us to do in terms of that. You know, so take something like ethnic outbidding, which is a huge explanation in the literature, something that Johanna is also working on right now and making great strides toward. You know, so we have this vast body of literature that basically says, you know, elites foment ethnic conflict for political gain. And, you know, to us, one of the key questions in that literature is, you know, when is that successful and when do followers follow? So that, for instance, is something we think we can get at, you know, through our data, and more specifically with our network analysis, is we can actually see when elites, we can not only look at when and, you know, ultimately we hope why elites put out these messages, but when do followers follow? When do people retweet them? You know, when do they gain currency? And so that's kind of some of what we're actually trying to do in many ways, is move from the group level to the individual level. And I think that to Anita's more specific question about, you know, are we interested at either changes in the same person over time in the way that they speak, or kind of more cross-sectional changes between individuals and the kind of individuals that may be empowered or start speaking? I think we would be interested in both of those. You know, to me, those both seem like they could contribute, you know, to the ethnicization of conflict. The other, I'm trying to kind of pick up on kind of larger points that went across the discussants. Another kind of question that I heard is, you know, what kinds of identities are we including and why, and more kind of more careful attention to that. And I think those comments are very welcome. So I'll just kind of briefly address you know, questions of a national identity and geography, which were raised by Laura and Johanna. So in terms of national identity, so we have not seen national identity as an identity in Syria because, you know, it's the case that, you know, so national, we see ethnic identities, and this also, I think, follows on upon Chandra in some ways, but we see ethnic identities as being exclusive identities in some way. And so because the category Syrian includes all Syrians to some degree, which would not be the case in some countries, it would be, you know, in other countries it may be the case that a national identity would exclude some members of the population. We have not included Syrian itself as an ethnic identity. And I think that could be controversial. I already see Laura kind of maybe, but
just to clarify what I mean, so not to include it as an ethnic identity, but to see increasing references to Syrian identity as a counterpoint to the ethnification. So if somebody's like, this is a conflict that was like driven by the Alawi, and someone's like, no, we're all Syrian.
Right. So this is actually what the counter ethnic rhetoric is hopefully going to capture. So that's like really common. That's like a place we see it a lot, is when people are sort of decrying sectarian narratives or saying things like, we're all Syrian.
Right, like a common, you know, protest slogan is like 111, the Syrian people are one, right? So something like that would be, you know, we think very much counter-sectarian or counter-ethnic.
But I think you're right, though, that we should think about it like possibly explicitly as like a subset, because it is like an important type of narrative that shows up quite a bit, you know, in this conflict in particular.
And if I can just kind of finish on this point, then we'll turn it back over to the discussants. Johanna also asked about geography. And these kind of geographic categories can be either ethnic or non-ethnic, depending on context. And so, that's something that I think takes really kind of deep country expertise, to unravel whether in a given context of, say a regional identity is ethnic or non-ethnic. And so, Alex and I are working on developing that expertise, but we are not Syrian specialists. We're both Middle Easternists with expertise initially in other areas. And so we also plan to consult with people who are, really true Syrian experts, in order to understand if those regional categories actually are ethnic or non-ethnic in the context of Syria.
Sorry.
That actually brings us a nice segue into another question that I had, which was in your coding, it wasn't entirely clear to me that when you were outsourcing in particular, that you were providing also the context of who was making the statement so that it could be evaluated in the context of who was making the statement. So for example, you say, well, it's ethnicization when it's used in a derogatory way, but we know, from context like the US, that depending on who uses the N-word, it means very different things. You're a young Black man, and then you sort of have ownership of that word, and as opposed to if you're a white person and using that word, it's a very different context. And so to evaluate whether that is ethnification of this language, you have to know the context also, and the context in your coding wasn't entirely clear. So if you could maybe clarify that a little bit, that would be.
Yeah, sure. So this is a great point, and this is why, so the current preliminary analysis we're showing is just, does it contain the words? And this is like a big problem with only doing it that way, is that you miss the context and the way in which the term might be used. And so what we are planning on doing is crowdsourcing the coding of this using Figure 8, which is this platform that has lots of native Arabic speakers on it. You can also segment that to just have Syrians code. There may not be enough Syrians on the platform to do that. And so I think we're going to see as a starting point how much we can get that way, but we may have to augment it with RA coding if we can't get enough Syrians through that platform. But basically we would ask them a series of questions about each tweet designed to try to get at this, like not only does it we know it contains this term, but beyond that, what is it expressing and towards whom?
If I can just kind of add to that, it seems, if I understood you correctly, Johanna, you were suggesting that we include the actor speaking in our actual definitions of ethnic rhetoric and non-ethnic rhetoric and counter-ethnic. And I have to confess, we have not thought of that. I think that it is possible that we may be able to get at that through, so our existing definitions have the purpose of the speech, and it's possible, that we would be sufficiently able to capture sort of the context and purpose from that without actually trying to include who is speaking as well and what their kind of positionality, to use that word, is to the term. But I think we'll have to kind of see when we get into the more, when we get into the human coding, how well we're able to capture purpose and context, or if we need to actually consider more explicitly who is speaking in the way you suggest. So I think that's a very, very welcome point for something, that we should pay attention to.
Yeah, Laura?
I think this also feeds into sort of one of the bigger picture questions that I had, and whether there was a way to do this sort of intentionally, in the sense that, when you think about ethnification and when you were talking about it, ethnification is sort of this intermediate outcome that we think then through different kinds of behaviors or actions, whether by increasing prejudice or the willingness to retreat derogatory information or increasing participation in violence, that the ethnification has some sort of behavioral outcome that is what actually deepens the conflict, right? So it could be the case that you have a big increase in ethnification in terms of people using these terms. But what you're actually interested in is sort of the willingness to retweet biased, discriminatory, prejudicial tweets, like that there are sort of behavioral outcomes, like increases in prejudice and willingness to use that kind of language that's like more towards the ultimate outcome of interest. So I guess, you know, one way to think about this would be, you know, to what extent is it important not just to look at the ethnification in terms of the increasing usage of these kinds of terms, but also to think about how you can use the Twitter data, the social media data, to try to think about looking at more distant outcomes and the consequences of the increasing usage of the terms for, so I think that like that separates a little bit. Like right now you're collapsing the derogatory use of the language and the labels themselves, whereas this would be, you know, increase the looking at the labels, but then the real outcome is, does it increase the use of the derogatory version of them, which would be associated with prejudice? Or, you know, how can we think about this a little bit more with ethnification as sort of the mechanism and like its link to the outcomes that we associate with conflict?
Yeah, this is super interesting. And one of the things that we've been talking about doing is kind of coming up with sort of like a typology of the language, like whether the term is being used more neutrally versus in a derogatory way. And in terms of your thinking about kind of outcomes linking to violence and that sort of thing, I mean, one of the things that I'm interested to explore in this data is, you know, does derogatory language precede violence or follow it, like, and when? And, you know, because we have this more real-time data, we can get a better understanding of these processes, because I don't think we always know sort of where the causal arrows are and what's preceding or following what.
And it's really like, even looking at your figures, it's actually kind of surprising. So the big spike is the 2011 to 2012, where you see this really big increase. But when you're just looking at the overall number of tweets in figure 1, there are no like events that seem to be driving that big increase in the use of sectarian language. So I found that actually quite puzzling in some ways, right? So this would suggest that it isn't necessarily events that were driving the increase of the sectarian. I don't know, I was curious to hear your thoughts about how to interpret sort of figure 1 versus figures 2 and 3.
Yeah, so part of it is that figures 2 and 3 are more kind of smooth to give the pattern in average, like, you know, in aggregate over time. We can also look at it in that same way, just like the daily spikes, and then you do see something, you know, a bit more comparable, but still there aren't just at first glance kind of these clear events driving it. And it may be partly that here we're collapsing derogatory and non-derogatory language altogether. And in my experience looking at just hate speech, like explicitly derogatory sectarian language, it tends to be much more event driven. So that might be, you know, along the lines of the distinctions you're talking about when we kind of tease out the different types of language.
Anita, did you want to jump in?
Yeah, so I on the measurement part, so I kind of saw, I totally see the incredible work you're putting into kind of really getting at all of these different categories. And as Joanna said, I think there's so much you can do with that. You can, you know, apply that to other conflicts. So I think that in and of itself is an incredibly interesting project. For this specific paper on Syria, I was wondering if you actually need, like, if you're doing too much, like in terms of like finishing one project and then kind of moving on. So one thing that you mentioned in the paper and that you just talked about, Alex, was the third-party influence, the role of third-party influence, and the kind of instrumentalization of ethnic narratives in order to kind of gain outside support, funding, and so on and so forth, right? That seems to have been a huge part of the ethnicization at the armed group level even. And so I'm wondering if for those groups you really have to kind of have this exhaustive understanding of all the different terms and all the different ways in which, you know, language is used, or if what you really want to do is kind of look at what kind of language would they be using if they wanted to appeal to certain outside funders, right? And then actually see if you can trace, because I mean, I think that would be super interesting for this paper, kind of have a almost like a detecting the influence, right? And their network analysis is super useful, right? You can see how it spreads through different networks. You can see who kind of the thought leaders are, and then how the framings. And I think for this paper, I'm not even sure if the focus would want to be on kind of, you know, all exhaustive possible ethnic groups, or if it's really actually I want to be kind of very specific and selective on the ones that I want to look at. That was the one thing. And then the other thing, and this maybe is already too much of a data discussion that we might want to have later, but one of the things I've been looking at, and I'm working on a project with Zach Steinerl-Threckeld, where we're looking at just tweets of people who geolocated themselves in Syria in between 2014 and 2017, so a little bit later than you're looking at. And one of the things we find is that it really, like, there's a huge change in who is tweeting depending on what the conflict dynamics are, right? And so people will like selectively censor themselves if there are massive offensives going on in their neighborhoods and so on. And so I think maybe that's not such a big of a problem for you because you have global data, right? And so that's likely not to be quite as affected by local changes in conflict dynamics. But I'm still wondering to what extent you're picking up differences because you're picking up changes in the conflict dynamics and who's coming forward and saying things and who's censoring themselves and so on and so forth. And so that was kind of a broader question I had about the data, but we might want to talk about that more later.
Johanna? Oops, you're muted.
You're muted, Joanna.
Oh, still muted.
I think you can unmute her.
Oh, you're right. I forgot. Sorry.
Sorry, my kids are running around and I have multiple animals, and so I was trying to not include all of that sound. So my question actually was related to what Anita was talking about, and builds and sort of relates to work that she has done earlier about missingness in data. And your story is this really interesting story of really the Assad regime starting this discussion and bringing in the terminology of ethnicity. And then it gets picked up relatively late by the opposition, according to your figures. And I was wondering whether the sort of predominance of ethnicization of the conflict had anything to do with who was tweeting, and if there was just fewer of the opposition tweeting at a later date in the conflict, and therefore the conflict seemed more ethnic because it was just predominated by the regime. So if you could clarify that a little bit, that's.
Yeah, so this is super interesting to think about.
We did have a quick two-finger from Laura.
Sorry.
You want to add on before you answer?
I was just gonna support that and say that we know, Alex and I know from working in Lebanon, that actually like the select people who are on Twitter is a very like small subset that is primarily elite driven. It's not widely used by ordinary people. So I think, you know, even contextualizing more broadly who's on Twitter would also be really helpful.
Yeah, so this is really, really useful to think about. So I think, like, obviously this data is not representative, right, either of Syrians or of people who are interested in the conflict globally. And so I think, you know, as a starting point, it's useful to say that I think it's valuable for tracking these shifting narratives over time, but we need to know something about, you know, who the population is and how it's changing. And in response to Anita's comment, I think, so when you just look at the geolocated data, as you mentioned, that's highly affected by local conflict dynamics, partly because people don't want to be visible and attached to their location in an obvious way. When you have the full universe where it's sort of self-reported location as well as estimating location based on people's networks, this might be a little bit less the case, but it's still really useful for us to see over time, how do the unique user groups change? So is it a different population tweeting at the beginning than the end? And that's something that we can actually track and say something about. And so it could be that the narrative changes because the population changes, or it could be that the same people are changing their discourse. And that's something that it'll be really important for us to look at, I think. Sorry, Yael, did you have a...
And I think both of those are going to be super interesting, right? Like regardless of what you find, I think those are both super interesting findings.
And at the local level, I'm just going to kind of quickly two-finger on that. At the local level, I think what we're hoping to do is, thinking about both those comments from you, Anita, and from Johanna, very much thinking about how things like territorial control and in conflicts, could affect the kinds of speech that are used even online, and one thing I've sort of just wondered about in my own head is that, in terms of kind of regular people who, quote unquote, relatively regular people who are on Twitter, could they even be using this to signal, to elites or signal to armed actors in charge? And so that's something we are attuned to, but just have not quite developed in the project yet.
And the other thing along those lines is we have the English language data from this time period too. So if there's an interesting signaling story about signaling narratives to the international community or that sort of thing, we might be able to get at that a bit too by sort of language differences as well.
Laura, did you have a two-finger?
Yeah, I think the signaling. The signaling story is really interesting. I had not thought about that, but now that you say it, it's, given that there are these differences in the internal and the external, that would be really interesting to see in a separate paper. You have several papers in there.
The other thing I wanted to say oh, sorry.
Go ahead.
Sorry, I think my internet is
say,
a little bit.
Yeah, same. I think I was frozen. Sorry. I think it's great that you have the English language to compare it to. I think that's fantastic. I didn't know that. I think that's going to be really interesting to compare. So the project we're working on is looking at kind of local level signaling. So just signaling to basically whoever's in charge. So I'm super happy, like once we're done, still going to take a while, I'd be super happy to send it to you. I think the signaling internationally is also going to be super interesting because of like this third party influence that you were talking about, and seeing like language differences is going to be fascinating, definitely.
So I think everyone's internet maybe got choppy for a second. Mine did too, but I saw Alex try to respond and I saw Laura try to jump in. So Laura, maybe, I
have a one finger. I have a separate.
Well, what I was going to say was, why don't we go ahead and collect sort of a final round of any pressing, like, just wanted to tell y'all, as in y'all, the authors, this, and then we'll take closing comments from the authors. So Laura, I think a different topic's totally fine, and now would be a good time.
Sure. Yeah, so I think one thing I wanted to make sure I mentioned is that for me right now, the weakest part of the paper is the Facebook survey data collection. And since this is underpinning the machine learning, I just wanted to give you a few things to think about. One is that the categories that we're seeing on Facebook are all going to be post-treatment, right? So you make this big point in the paper about wanting to map pre-conflict ethnic structure, but what people's reference categories are today, how they think about them, they're all now, we're 9 years into the conflict. So that's a big disconnect. And I think I'm not quite sure how to resolve that unless there's some way to validate the kinds of categories that people are raising now with what people were using on Facebook or Twitter at the start of the conflict. But I think you guys are going to need to put some thought into how to reconcile that. It also wasn't clear to me exactly how you were going to do this in a way that isn't priming people to think about some categories over others. So the fact that it's in Arabic, the fact that you talked about using the Syrian flag, even the fact, like, it wasn't even clear to me how you were going to elicit the categories and what language you were going to use to elicit, like whether you were going to use the list or, but I think you have to think very carefully both about avoiding priming effects but also obviously eliciting in a way that isn't too academic or too sterile or like, too far away from how people think about the categories. And then also obviously to talk about differences in usership between Facebook and Twitter, right? So that are the kinds of categories that you're eliciting on Facebook going to be equally applicable to Twitter, given that there might be different populations of people who use them for different reasons. So I don't know how much money you're planning on investing, but given that it's underpinning one of the big methods you're going to use for the Twitter analysis, I think more explanation there would be really helpful.
Other final comments from Anita or Johanna?
Yeah, so I think my final, I mean, I'm happy to send you the smaller, maybe less interesting comments I had. I think one of the things I was wondering is if you, and you have incredible data, you have, I think you said 30 million observations. I was wondering if you could take a random sample of accounts, because I think the account level here is going to be really interesting to kind of get at this question of if you're seeing, like, giving you basically some panel data and like looking if you're seeing individual changes over time or not. If you could take a random sample of the geolocated tweets that you're interested in, so maybe Syria, Iran, I don't know, the US, right? And then go back and scrape those timelines. Now, clearly, a lot of those accounts are going to be gone now and people self-censor, and that's a whole other thing, right? But it would still give you a little bit of new data. And you could even see if some of the tweets that are in your current sample are now gone, and if more of the, for example, unifying tweets or more of the ethnic tweets have been deleted. And then that would also give you kind of an idea of, have these things, has it become more dangerous to talk about non-sectarian kind of unifying things, and that's why people have now deleted them, and so on and so forth. I think just kind of going back to the account level would really kind of increase the things you could do with the data.
Johanna?
Just on the data, similarly to Laura, I thought that was the immediate thought that I had was that the Facebook experiment or survey is happening now, and so it's not going to give you an accurate representation of what's being, what the dictionary should be at the outset of the conflict. And I was wondering, sort of similarly to what Anita was suggesting, whether instead of doing that, you could scrape archives of blogs, or you sort of mentioned this in the bag of communities discussion, but it wasn't clear to me whether you were going to do that and then how. And I didn't really see the added value of the Facebook experiment if you are able to go back and sort of scrape a dictionary to see how it changes over time.
Yael and Alex, if you want to take a very quick moment to have closing comments, I think you've gotten an awesome set of discussion today, and you can always rewatch this entire thing in case you didn't take great notes, which is an added benefit.
Awesome. Yeah, so, thank you all again. Let me start off by saying that I think the suggestions on the Facebook survey are very, very welcome, particularly about the priming. I had not thought of that, so thank you, Laura. On the ex post nature of the survey, I should clarify that we're not actually using the Facebook survey to determine the categories. Those are determined through our mapping of the pre-conflict ethnic structure, but we are using it to determine the language that's used around those categories. Now that, of course, too could change over time. So that is a problem, and I think supplementing it with some other kind of source, like Johanna suggests, is probably the way to go. But we're a little less worried about it maybe because the identity categories are not coming from the survey. It's just kind of the different language labels that people might use to refer to a specific category. The other kind of thing I just wanted to add broadly, and I know we're out of time, but everyone has sort of commented on the ambitiousness of this, and our plan for this, I should say, is a book as well as a few separate papers. And in the book, what we're hoping to do beyond kind of set up this conceptual and methodological infrastructure and exploring the Syria case is also exploring other cases, including potentially cases of de-ethnicization or non-ethnicization. And so I just also wanted to throw out that if you have any ideas as to what other cases we may consider, we would love to explore those. So I'll leave it at that. I don't know if Alex, if you have anything to add.
Yeah, I just want to say thank you all. This is super helpful. And yes, as Yael mentioned, this paper is kind of a place where we've dumped several in progress things. And so I think moving forward, it will probably be split up into some a bit more separately so that we can really sort of hone in on more specific, interesting questions. But we could not imagine a better group of discussants to give us kind of food for thought and how to move the different parts of this forward. So thank you so much to you all, and thanks to Cassie for organizing.
Yeah, thank you all so much.
Yes. I appreciate everyone making the time. That's what makes these workshops possible. So thank you, and thank you for doing that during a pandemic. It's like extra wonderful. I hope this was useful for the authors, and like I said, this will absolutely be posted on the Colloquia tab of the Peace Science website. So if you want to go to it, or if you next year want to teach your students how to have a good discussion that's healthy and kind and smart, you could always just link to your own discussant skills using our OPSC workshop. So the next presentation actually for us is not until the fall. So thank you for wrapping up our spring session. It was really, really great. And again, I appreciate all of your time. So have a good weekend, and feel free to email Yael and Alex with the remaining comments. Bye, everyone.
Thank you so much, Cassie.
Thanks, guys.
Thanks for a great paper.
Good luck.
Yeah.